April 1945, Dresden. A German nurse stood terrified in a dark hospital basement, convinced the next sound she heard would be her execution from the American soldiers. She had worn the Nazi uniform, tended to wounded soldiers of the Reich, and believed the Americans would show her no mercy. But what happened in those final hours would change everything she believed about the Americans, and led to her becoming the chief surgical nurse under American command in World War II. Before continuing, thank you for being here. Stories like this stay buried until someone chooses to listen. Please share where you're watching from. Your presence here matters. Today, we uncover the true story of Sister Margarete Adler. The air shook with the rhythm of shell fire. Sister Margarete gripped a tray of surgical tools as the walls of the Statistischen Krankenhaus trembled. American artillery had battered the city for 2 relentless days. Above her, the once proud Wehrmacht hospital, where she'd worked for years, now lay half in ruins. Dust poured from the cracked ceiling with every explosion. The moans of wounded German soldiers echoed from the floors above, mixing with the whine of incoming shells. She was 28, young, disciplined, a trained surgical nurse and very terrified. Every crash reminded her how close death was. Then came the sound she feared most, heavy boots approaching down the corridor. She braced herself. Margarete had heard the stories. Every German had. The propaganda minister's warnings still echoed in her mind. The Americans will show no mercy. They will execute doctors and nurses who serve the Reich. They will turn Germany into a wasteland. They will take women and... She tried not to imagine the rest of what they'd said about what would happen to women. Her thoughts stopped there. She couldn't bear to finish them. Her hands moved on instinct, wrapping a blood-soaked bandage around the leg of a wounded boy who could not have been more than 16. His voice trembled. "Sister, what will they do to us?" Margarete didn't answer. She couldn't. She had done everything her country asked of her. A loyal member of the NS Frauenschaft since 1939, she had nursed Wehrmacht soldiers, SS officers, even Gestapo agents who passed through those corridors. Her hands had saved lives, but they had done so under the wrong flag, the enemy's flag. The oath she had sworn to the Reich now felt like a curse tied around her neck. Outside, the gunfire grew sharper, no longer distant but close. She could hear the distinct rhythm of American M1 rifles, the shouted commands in English. Each sound drove the fear deeper. Then came a crash. The basement door at the top of the stairs rattled violently. Someone was trying to break in. Most people will scroll away and forget this ever happened. But not you. You have stayed. So please subscribe, because more mind-blowing stories are coming your way. Margarete froze, her breath trapped halfway in her chest. This was it, the moment she had dreaded since the first Allied planes crossed the Rhine. She thought of her parents in Hamburg and wondered if they were still alive, or already ash among the ruins left by the firebombing. The handle turned slowly, metal scraping against metal. Light spilled through the crack. And as the door opened, Margarete realized the face she was about to see would decide whether she lived or died. Her brother was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Her fiancé had been killed at Normandy. There was no one left, no family, no home, no future. Only these wounded boys huddled in the flickering dark, waiting for death, and depending on her to do what? Stay? Die beside them? Pretend she could still save them? The door at the top of the stairs gave a sharp crack, then splintered open. Boots thundered down the steps, voices barked commands in English. Margarete closed her eyes, waiting for the end. She'd heard what the Soviets had done to German nurses on the Eastern Front. The Americans, she told herself, would be no different. War stripped all men of mercy, and she was the enemy. Her heart pounded. She braced for the gunshot, for whatever came next. But instead of a bullet there was a voice, calm, firm, and unmistakably American, and the man who appeared through the smoke didn't look like an executioner. The first American down those stairs was a medic, Technical Sergeant Jack Turner, 3rd Infantry Division. Margarete didn't know his name yet, But one detail burned itself into her mind, the massive Red Cross armband on his sleeve, glowing stark white against the grime. A medic with a Thompson submachine gun in his hand. Margarette's instincts took over. She lifted her hands, stepping in front of her patients, a frail shield between the wounded boys and the armed strangers. Her white nurse's uniform, now streaked with blood and soot, hung in tatters. Strands of blonde hair fell loose around her face, dusted in ash. She must have looked more ghost than woman. A ghost still trying to protect the dying. The soldier raised his weapon and hesitated. That single pause, that heartbeat of uncertainty, would change the course of her life. And the Americans too. Krankenschwester, she stammered, her voice trembling. Nurse! It was the only word she could manage. Her throat was too dry, her fear too thick. Turner froze for a heartbeat. Then he lowered his weapon. His eyes swept across the basement, the rows of wounded German soldiers lying on makeshift cots, blood-soaked bandages stacked in buckets, and a crude operating table where someone had been performing surgeries until recently. Dr. Weber's coat still hung on a chair. He had fled hours earlier, leaving Margarette alone with a 17-year-old orderly now cowering inside a supply closet. Turner exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ! Then his voice echoed up the stairs. Captain, get Doc Cohen down here, now. We've got wounded Krauts and a German nurse trying to keep them alive by herself. Margarette couldn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. It wasn't hatred, it was a command. This was the voice of a medic who had found patients in need. Moments later, more American soldiers crowded into the cellar. Their boots clattered against the stone floor. One man stepped through the doorway, pushing past the others. Captain Samuel Cohen, a U.S. Army doctor from Brooklyn. He was short, dark-haired, his round glasses reflecting the dim lantern light. He glanced from Margarette to the wounded soldiers and back again, his expression unreadable. A Jewish doctor, standing face to face with a German nurse in a Nazi hospital. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them held decades of hate, ideology, and something neither side could name yet. Respect. Then, in a quiet voice, Cohen said something that made Margarette realize she might actually live. She couldn't have known that this meeting, in a ruined basement beneath Dresden, would mark the beginning of an unlikely alliance that history would nearly erase. "Do you speak English?" Captain Cohen asked, his voice calm but firm. "A little," Margarette whispered. "Nicht viel." He nodded, then switched to hesitant German. "Ich Ihr name?" "Adler, Margarette Adler. Ich bin Krankenschwester, I am a nurse." Cohen studied her carefully, not as an enemy, but as a colleague under impossible circumstances. "How many operations have you assisted in?" he asked. She blinked, struggling to process the question. This wasn't interrogation, it sounded like an interview. I do not." The English dissolved on her tongue. Turner stepped closer. "Cap, I think she's in shock. Let me try." He looked at Margarette and spoke slowly, his German surprisingly clear, picked up from his grandmother back in Milwaukee. "Sister, the captain is a surgeon. He needs to know if you can assist him. We've got wounded, both sides." Margarette stared, her voice trembling. "You want me to help you? I thought you would kill." Turner's eyes softened. "Ma'am, we're medics. We took the same oath you did, the Hippocratic Oath. It doesn't stop at borders." It wasn't just his compassion speaking. Across Europe, American field hospitals had been ordered to treat enemy soldiers with the same care as their own. Eisenhower's directive was clear. Medicine was neutral. Even amid war, the oath still mattered. The echo of his words, "The oath doesn't stop at borders," lingered in her mind. It would come back to test her when she faced the first wounded American brought to her table. Margarette's knees gave way beneath her, and Turner caught her by the elbow before she hit the floor. That single, steadying touch, gentle, unthinking, human, cracked something deep inside her. The walls she'd built over months of horror gave way. She started to cry, great heaving sobs that she had been holding back for days, weeks, months. "It's all right," Turner murmured, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now. Let it out. Then, we've got work to do." Captain Cohen stepped forward, and Margarette instinctively tensed, expecting reprimand, or worse. But he only unscrewed his canteen and held it out. "Water," he said simply. "Drink. Then we talk about how to help these men." The water hit her tongue cold and clean. She hadn't tasted anything so pure in weeks. As she drank, her eyes followed the Americans moving through the basement. Calm, precise, focused. They changed bandages, gave morphine, and set up transfusions. The Red Cross armbands glowed faintly in the lantern light. These were not executioners. They were saving them. Wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve, Margaret forced herself upright. "I can help," she said carefully in broken English. "I am good nurse, 3 years here, many surgery operations." Cohen studied her for a moment, then nodded once, and for the first time smiled. "Good," he said. "Then let's work, Sister Adler. These boys need every hand we can spare." Turner's words echoed faintly. "You're safe now." She wanted to believe that. But before the night was over, she would learn how fragile safety could be. But Margarete's true test hadn't come yet. In just a few weeks, she would face a decision that would define everything that followed, the rest of her life. For now, the hours blurred together, but it was a different kind of blur. One not born of fear or chaos, but of purpose. Captain Cohen didn't just permit her to assist, he trusted her, leaned on her skill as if she were one of his own. When the Americans converted what was left of the hospital's upper floors into a field unit, he placed her on the surgical team. Not as a captive, not as forced labor, but as a peer. "Sister Adler," he would say mid-operation, his voice steady even as shells echoed in the distance. "Retractor, please. Good. Now suction. Excellent." Each word, each gesture, dismantled the image she'd been taught to believe. The ruthless enemy, the merciless invader. Still, a part of her braced for cruelty, for the sudden snap of betrayal she'd seen too many times before. But it never came. On the second day, she heard the rumble of engines outside. A supply convoy had arrived. Margarete stepped into the sunlight, watching as American medics unloaded crate after crate. Sulfur powder, morphine, surgical instruments, clean bandages, the lifeblood of any hospital. She had never seen such abundance. The Reich hospitals had been stripped bare for months. Now, for the first time in years, she felt what hope might look like. "You followed Margaret this far. Don't stop now. Most people scroll past stories like this and forget. But not you. You felt something. Don't just watch, subscribe before the next secret disappears." Captain Cohen noticed the distant look in her eyes. "Something wrong, sister?" Margarete hesitated, her voice low. We never had this. For months we operated with almost nothing. Sometimes we boiled our instruments in potato water because there was no disinfectant. We washed and reused bandages until they disintegrated." Cohen gave a faint, understanding smile. "And now you have everything you need. That's the difference. American industry, and a belief that every wounded soul deserves care. Yours included." That afternoon, a major from the 45th Infantry Division arrived to inspect the newly established field hospital. He was a square-built man named Miller, his uniform spotless, his expression permanently unimpressed. When his eyes landed on Margarete, dressed in surgical scrubs, standing beside an operating table, his reaction was instant. "Captain," Miller barked, "is that a German nurse assisting in ROR?" Margarete went rigid. Her hands clenched at her sides. This, she thought, was it, the end of her fragile reprieve. But before she could speak, Cohen stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "Yes, sir," he said evenly. "Sister Adler is the most skilled surgical nurse in this hospital. In the last 30 to 6 hours, we've completed 37 operations, only 1 post-operative loss. I'd credit a good portion of that success to her training and precision." Miller stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Marguerite could hear her own pulse in her ears. She thought again of that first night, the moment Turner lowered his gun instead of firing. Not all enemies pull the trigger. Miller finally turned to Cohen. "Captain, I hope you know what you're doing. The brass won't like this." Miller's voice cut through the room like a blade. "She a Nazi?" The words hung heavy in the air. Margarete felt heat rush to her face. She had been one, at least on paper, a member of the party, a nurse in their hospitals, a believer once in Germany's promised greatness. But that faith had died long before the Reich itself began to crumble. Cohen didn't flinch. "She's a nurse, sir," he said quietly but with authority. "And a damn good one." For a moment Miller just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a short nod. "Carry on." When the door closed behind him, Margaret finally exhaled. Her knees felt weak. Cohen placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You all right? Why?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Why are you protecting me? Why are you treating our wounded? Why are you being so kind?" A faint, almost melancholy smile touched his lips. "Because that's what we do, sister. That's who we are." His words echoed the same belief Turner had spoken days earlier, that oath doesn't have borders. But Margarete didn't yet understand how deeply that truth ran for Cohen himself, because what she didn't know was that Captain Samuel Cohen was hiding something that made his compassion toward a German nurse nothing short of extraordinary. April 17th, 1945. Margaret stood beside him in the operating room, assisting with an emergency amputation on a young Wehrmacht corporal named Hans Keller. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. He wept for his mother even as the chloroform mask covered his face. Halfway through the procedure, his pulse began to plummet. The air thickened with panic. Cohen barked orders trying to stanch the bleeding, while Margarete, trembling but focused, worked the anesthesia valve with desperate precision. The monitor was flatlined. Margaret froze. Cohen shouted something she didn't catch. Then, as the boy's lifeless hand slipped from the table, a secret came crashing out that would change everything she thought she knew about the man standing beside her. The pinned comment includes a survival guide, hands-on wilderness tips, family emergency checklists, and how to prepare for the unexpected peril. Check it out. "Come on, kid," Cohen muttered, sweat dripping down his brow. "Don't you die on my table." For a moment everything stopped, the bleeding, the sound, even the air itself. Then the boy's heart monitor flickered back to life. He was alive. When Hans Keller woke several hours later, his face pale and eyes unfocused, Margarete was still there. She hadn't moved in 4 hours, watching every breath, every tremor. When the realization hit him that his leg was gone, he broke down, sobbing like a child. Margaret said nothing. She simply held his hand and let him grieve. The following morning, Sergeant Turner appeared in the ward, his uniform smudged with dust but his expression light. He handed Marguerite a small, crinkled package. "For the kid," he said. "Heard he had a rough night." Margarete frowned, turning the item over in her hands. A Hershey's chocolate bar, real American chocolate. "But he's the enemy," she said softly. Turner shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "He's a scared kid who lost his leg. Chocolate helps, trust me." Later, when she gave it to Keller, he stared at it as if she'd placed a bar of gold in his hands. "The Americans gave this to me?" he whispered, astonished. "Yes," Margarete replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why?" She didn't answer, because she didn't know either. She remembered her own trembling hands in that same basement weeks before, expecting death but receiving mercy instead. Over the next several nights, something quietly remarkable began to happen. Lieutenant Grace Miller, a 23-year-old American nurse from Tennessee, found Margaret sitting alone outside the ward during a late-night break. The two women began to talk. First cautiously, then openly. Nancy spoke about her fiancé, David, who was fighting somewhere under Patton's command. Margarete shared that her own fiancé had been killed on the beaches of Normandy. Somewhere in that conversation, the lines drawn by flags and uniforms faded. The war, the ideology, the propaganda, all of it seemed smaller in the face of shared grief. They weren't enemies. They were just two women, frightened and mourning people they would never see again. But the fragile peace of those nights would soon give way to something that stunned everyone, including Margarete herself. On April 28th, weeks after the Americans had taken control of the hospital, Captain Cohen summoned her to his makeshift office. The moment she received the message, her stomach tightened. She was certain this was it, the end of her strange reprieve. Surely this was when they would finally send her to a POW camp. The kindness, the trust, it all had to end eventually. When she entered, Cohen was standing behind a battered desk covered in paperwork and medical reports. He gestured for her to sit. "Sister Adler," he began, his tone formal but warm, "I've been watching your work these past weeks. I'm not just impressed, I'm astonished. You are, without exaggeration, one of the most capable surgical nurses I've ever worked beside. And I trained at Johns Hopkins, with some of the best in the world." Margaret blinked, caught completely off guard. Compliments were not what she expected, especially not from the enemy. And as the weight of those words sank in, Margarete realized that sometimes history doesn't erase mercy, it's built by it. "We're expanding," Cohen began, his tone brisk but steady. "The US Army has ordered a full takeover of the hospital complex. From now on, we'll be treating not just our wounded, but German civilians and POWs as well. It's going to be a massive operation, and I need someone who knows this place inside and out, someone who understands the staff, the layout and the patients." Margarete frowned, unsure where he was going with this. "Sir, I don't understand." Cohen's expression softened into a faint smile. "Sister Adler, I'm appointing you as chief surgical nurse of this hospital. You'll report directly to me and oversee all nursing operations, German and American alike. You'll coordinate staff assignments, maintain surgical readiness, and supervise both your countrywomen and my American nurses. In this building, your authority will match that of any American officer of equal standing." For a moment she could only stare at him, the words refusing to make sense. "But I'm German," she stammered. "I wore the uniform. I was part of the party. I'm supposed to be—" "You're a nurse," Cohen interrupted gently. "And a damn good one. The war's ending, sister. What matters now isn't who wore what uniform. It's who can help rebuild what's left, and I can't do that without you. So—" He extended his hand. "Will you take the position?" Margarete's hands trembled. Her throat tightened. "Yes," she managed at last. "Yes, I accept." Cohen stood and took her hand firmly in his. For a moment, the war outside seemed to vanish. There were tears glinting behind his glasses when he said, "Thank you, sister. Now let's get to work. We've got a lot of people who need saving." Margaret thought of the first day they met, the moment she'd stood in front of the wounded, certain an American bullet would end her life. Now that same army was entrusting her to save theirs. What she didn't yet know was that Cohen's compassion came from a place far deeper and far more painful than simple duty, because the truth about why he had chosen her would surface soon, in a single confession that would change the way she saw everything, including herself. If you're someone who loves the forest, the canyon, or the quiet safety of the woods, remember, even there, danger can find you. Sister Margaret learned how to survive the darkest kind of wilderness. People. Get the survival guide in the pinned comment before you ever need it. In the weeks that followed, as Germany crumbled and finally surrendered, Margaret watched the Americans transform the hospital into something she hadn't thought possible. It wasn't charity, it was policy. German prisoners of war received the same care as wounded American soldiers. Civilians, once terrified to approach, were treated with calm respect and professionalism. One afternoon in early May, not long after the surrender, stretcher-bearers rushed in a wounded SS officer. He'd been dragged out of a collapsed bunker, pale from blood loss, a black uniform sleeve still clinging to his arm. Margaret froze. SS, the very symbol of terror and brutality. Part her expected, perhaps even wanted, the Americans to turn away. Instead, Captain Cohen scrubbed in and spent hours fighting for the man's life. When it was over, he emerged from surgery drenched in sweat and streaked with blood. Seeing Margaret's conflicted stare, he gave a faint, weary smile. "You're wondering why I saved him," he said. Margarete hesitated. He was SS Cohen met her eyes. He was also a human being bleeding to death. That's reason enough. He paused, removing his glasses, revealing exhaustion. And something heavier. "You probably guessed I'm Jewish. My grandmother's family lived in Poland. I haven't heard from them since 42. I know what the SS did. I know about the camps." His voice faltered but didn't break. But I'm a doctor, not an executioner. I took an oath to heal whoever's in front of me. That's what the Geneva Convention demands. That's what my conscience demands. And that's what being American means to me. When Margarete had first told him, "But I am German," the enemy, he'd said, "You're a nurse." Now, as she watched him save a sworn enemy, she finally understood what he meant. For the first time, Margarete wondered, when the war's wounds were finally stitched shut, who would be left to heal the healers themselves. Margarete realized then that this wasn't weakness at all. It was strength in its purest form. The kind that demanded you hold on to your humanity even when the world around you had lost it. To show mercy where there had been none. To hold yourself to a standard your enemies had long abandoned. But Margarete's story, and the hospital story, didn't end there. What unfolded next would quietly shape how Germans and Americans saw each other for decades to come. The kindness she'd witnessed wasn't random or sentimental, it was deliberate. It came from a deep-rooted American military principle, one that valued discipline, honor, and the moral high ground even in victory. Captain Cohen explained it one quiet evening as they sat reviewing supply lists under the flicker of a single lamp. "You know what my commanding officer told us in training," he said. "The way we treat prisoners says nothing about them and everything about us." I never forgot that. The results proved it. Of the roughly 371,000 German POWs held in US camps, fewer than 1% died, mostly from wounds sustained before capture or from illness. In comparison, mortality among Soviet prisoners in German camps had exceeded 50%, and even Allied POWs in German hands suffered death rates between 5 and 10%. At the 127th Evacuation Hospital in Dresden, where Margarete now supervised operations, the records spoke volumes. Between April and December 1945, they treated over 8,000 patients, soldiers and civilians alike. Nearly 60% were German. The survival rate? An astonishing 98%, exactly the same as for the American wounded. For anyone who hikes the canyons or walks the forests thinking you're safe, the real danger isn't the wild, it's what happens when mercy disappears. Sister Margaret's story proves that. The survival guide in the pinned comment might just help you when it matters. Margarete's diary entries from that period, later donated to the National Archives in 1957, trace her quiet transformation with startling clarity. April 15th. The Americans have arrived. I expect execution. May 1. Captain Cohen gave me a letter of recommendation for exemplary service. I cannot understand these people. They should hate us. We have taken so much from them. Yet they show kindness. By June, her tone had shifted completely. Everything they told us was lies. The Americans are not monsters. They are not here to destroy Germany. They are trying to rebuild it. They treat our wounded, feed our civilians, and show us a mercy we never gave. I am ashamed of what I once believed, ashamed of what my country did. But I am grateful to be allowed a second chance. Margarete Adler would continue as chief surgical nurse at the hospital until 1949, serving under 4 successive American medical officers as the facility transitioned from military to civilian control. In those years, she trained over 120 German nurses in modern medical techniques and helped lay the foundation for post-war medical education across the American zone. When Captain Cohen finally returned to the United States in December 1947, he left Margarete a personal letter, one she would keep folded among her belongings until her death. In it he wrote, "Sister Adler, you've proven that even in war's darkest hours human decency can endure. You reminded me that Germany still has a soul worth saving. Thank you for your service, your discipline, and your friendship. The world needs more people like you." Margarete never married. When a journalist asked her about it during a 1962 interview, she replied softly, "I lost my fiancé to the war, and I gave the rest of my life to healing what that war broke. That was enough." In 1956, a letter arrived from the United States. It was from Sergeant Turner, the same medic who had first found her in the hospital basement. He had returned home, used the GI Bill to attend medical school, and was now a practicing doctor in Milwaukee. "Working with you changed me," he wrote. "You made me want to save lives instead of just patching wounds." They would exchange letters for the next 3 decades. Lieutenant Grace Miller also kept in touch. Every Christmas, Margarete received a card from Tennessee with a photo of Miller's growing family. Her fiancé, David, had survived the war, and together they had 4 children. In a 1972 note, Miller wrote, "You are my reminder that something good came out of all that horror. You were my friend when it mattered most." In 1979, Margarete Adler was invited to the United States by the American Red Cross Medical Corps as part of a tribute to wartime medical personnel. She spent 3 weeks touring hospitals across the country, and during that trip she was reunited with Sergeant Turner and Lieutenant Miller. The 3 appeared together on a Milwaukee news program, seated side by side, their bond still visible after more than 3 decades. "We were enemies once," Turner told the interviewer. "But Sister Adler made me realize something. Our enemy was never the German people. It was the ideology that ruled them. She was as much a victim as any of us." Margarete's story spread throughout Germany, shared in newspapers, classrooms, and veterans' gatherings. Her experience became a symbol of what mercy could accomplish after devastation. The humane treatment of German POWs and civilians had planted seeds of trust, seeds that grew into the post-war reconciliation between Germany and the United States. When the Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western Europe, it succeeded not just because of money, but because of trust. Germans had already witnessed American compassion firsthand in hospitals like Margarete's, where former enemies worked side by side to save lives. The wisdom of that approach revealed itself in the Cold War years. West Germany became one of America's most reliable allies, a stronghold against Soviet expansion. The memories lingered. American doctors stitching up German soldiers, GIs sharing chocolate with starving children, engineers restoring broken cities. Margarete spent the rest of her life telling that story. She spoke at universities, veterans associations, and youth programs, always returning to the same truth. They had every reason to hate us, she would say, but they chose humanity instead. That choice didn't just save lives, it rebuilt nations. Those words echoed the lesson Captain Cohen had taught her decades earlier. The way we treat our prisoners says nothing about them and everything about us. In 1995, Margarete Adler, then 78 and frail, made one final journey across the Atlantic. She had been invited by the American Red Cross Medical Corps to attend the 50th anniversary of VE Day in New York City. Despite her failing health, she was 78 years old and frail, but she insisted on making the trip. At a reception that evening, a young German diplomat approached her shyly. "Sister Adler," he said, "I was told you worked with the Americans during the occupation." "I did," she answered, her voice still steady despite the years. The diplomat smiled. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about American soldiers who shared food with her family when they were starving. She said, 'Without them, I would not be alive.'" Margarete's eyes softened. "Then I am glad they were there," she said quietly, "and I am glad I was too." In her final interview before her passing in 2002, Margarete was asked what her years in that war-torn hospital had taught her. Her reply was gentle, but carried the weight of a lifetime. "I learned that propaganda is easy, but truth is hard. It's easy to brand someone your enemy, to stop seeing the human being inside the uniform. What the Americans did was the harder thing. They looked past who we were supposed to be and saw who we truly were. They saw me, a German, a former party member, someone who had served the losing side, and still, they saw a nurse, a colleague, a person. That act of seeing, of recognizing my humanity, didn't just save others' lives, it saved my soul." Those were the same words Captain Cohen had once lived by. We treat people not because of who they are, but because of who we are. She paused, her voice trembling even after all those years. "I spent the first 30 years of my life as a German," she said softly, "and the next 50 trying to live up to the example those Americans showed me, learning to see people as people, not as enemies. choosing mercy over vengeance, healing instead of harming. Did you succeed? The interviewer asked. Margarete gave a faint, wistful smile. I tried every day, she said. That's all anyone can do. Her gravestone in Dresden bears a simple inscription, Margarete Adler, nurse, healer, bridge between enemies. The headstone was funded by American veterans of the 3rd Infantry Division and by the families of German patients she once cared for. At her funeral, both the American consul and the mayor of Dresden spoke. But the most touching tribute came from Hans Keller's son, the boy soldier who once received the chocolate bar. Now 62 and retired from teaching, he travelled from Frankfurt to honour the woman who had saved his father's life. Sister Adler saved my father's life twice, the man said softly to the mourners. Once on the operating table beside Captain Cohen, and again when she stayed with him through his darkest night, reminding him that compassion still had a place in this world. She gave him hope, and that hope brought him home. It helped him rebuild, start a family, and raise me. I stand here today because, in the ashes of war, Americans and Germans chose to see each other not as enemies, but as human beings. Because of people like Sister Adler, who built bridges where others saw only ruins. Margarete Adler's journey, from a frightened nurse under the Nazi regime to a lifelong voice for German-American reconciliation, shows how dignity can outlast destruction. You can't force peace through violence, but you can plant its roots through respect. For every generation that faces conflict, the same question endures. Can we separate the ideology we fight from the people trapped within it? Can we stay true to our values when our enemies abandon theirs? Margarete's life gives an answer, not in words but in the quiet proof of her choices. Yes, we can, and yes, we must. The Americans who treated Margarete with respect didn't do it because she had earned it. They did it because their principles required it, because they knew that how you treat someone when you hold power over them reveals the truth of your character. On April 15, 1945, Margarete Adler stood in a cold basement expecting death. She expected retribution. She expected to pay for her country's sins with her life. Instead, she met Sergeant Turner's calm steadiness, Captain Cohen's quiet respect, and Lieutenant Miller's unexpected kindness. She found Americans who looked past the uniform, who saw a nurse before they saw a German. They offered dignity before judgment, and in doing so they embodied not just military discipline but something deeper, the spirit of their nation. That moment didn't just change her, it changed an entire hospital, a city, and eventually a generation. For the rest of her life, Margarete tried to honour the mercy that had saved her in 1945. She became the bridge those Americans had built, healing where others sought to hate, and proving through her work that compassion can outlast even the scars of war. Many of you watching lived through the Cold War that rose from the ashes of this story. You watched Germany turn from a defeated enemy into one of America's closest allies. Now you know one of the reasons why. If you or your parents served during that era, or if your family has stories from the occupation of Germany, I'd love for you to share them in the comments. These memories are fading with each generation, but they remind us what humanity can look like, even after war. In a world that's forgotten how to forgive, Elizabeth's story shows what real strength looks like. Don't let stories like hers disappear into silence. Stay here, where we remember what it means to be human.